Hi, everybody. So, as some of you know, I was experiencing some technical difficulties with my part two for this week's lesson. So I'm just going to re-record it and repost it. So this week, again, we're looking at chapters 7 and 8 of your textbook. So this is part 2, again, looking at chapter 7 of your textbook. And where part 1 left off was looking at socioeconomic status or social class. So this is kind of our technical language in psychology to refer to essentially your economic status, right? The income that you make, your material assets. So that could be a house or a car, for example, your occupation level, the level of education that you have, for example. And what we know about socioeconomic status, which we shorten to SES, is that it typically makes a very big difference in the amount of resources that a person has at his or her disposal, and therefore the kind of power that an individual might be able to exercise over his or her life. Now, we know that somebody's socioeconomic status can have a very big influence on how they see themselves, their self-image and identity. Of course, it affects things like educational opportunities, the environment that you live in, the extent to which you can meet your basic needs. And all of that can have a very big impact on our psychological well-being. Of course, because if you are an individual who has a hard time making ends meet and, at the end of the month, perhaps you don't have enough money left over for the extra kinds of things, even things like groceries or certain bills that you'd like to pay, that can be an extremely stressful experience to go through. So socioeconomic status is one of these things that we have to consider within the dimensions of diversity, again, because we also know that individuals who are discriminated against because of being in poverty, that is a very real experience for a lot of people. The term that we use to refer to that, I'll just type that here on the screen, is, there we go, classism. Classism is the term that we use to refer to people who experience discrimination based on their socioeconomic status. So again, for example, we often find that a lot of people have negative beliefs about people who live in poverty, people who are homeless, for example, and there might be certain prejudices or biases that people have about these groups of folks. So that would be a form of oppression or discrimination targeted at this group. All right, so let's spend a little bit of time talking about another element of diversity, another dimension of diversity, ability and disability. So, of course, this is just referring to, the extent to which a person experiences a form of ability or disability in his or her everyday life. There are lots of different types of disabilities, some of which are captured here in this image, right? So is this a person who uses, a physical assistive device to get around? Perhaps they are hearing impaired or visually impaired. Perhaps they have an intellectual or developmental disability, that kind of thing. So there's a huge amount of diversity amongst this group, which is really important to keep in mind. So this is a huge group of people as well. And the other piece that's important for folks to keep in mind when we're talking about ability and disability is that most people at some point in their life will experience some form of a disability. It might not be as serious as what other people with a disability might experience, you know what I mean? But it could, be the result of a physical injury or serious illness that a person is experiencing. Perhaps a person could experience a disability associated with a psychological disorder that they're struggling with at a particular time. Some disabilities are permanent, some disabilities are temporary. Right, we can overcome, the situation that is disabling in some way or another. So, again, lots and lots of diversity within this group. Now, the term that you're seeing here is the term that we use to refer to discrimination that is targeted toward people with disabilities. And ableism is, of course, when we make a non-factual or negative judgment about somebody with a disability. Perhaps we, make an assumption about a person based on their disability. Some of the common social experiences of ableism are things like stigma, right? People often find that there are certain biases or prejudices associated with ableism, right? Society might have certain kinds of stigmas or negative values or beliefs about folks with disabilities. And we also unfortunately find that a lot of folks with disabilities are excluded from certain areas of society, be it, an area of society that does not have, physical accessibility to a building, be it, a different opportunity, that might not be accessible in another way. So that's a really important piece to keep in mind. Now, we're doing a lot better in our society in general when it comes to improving accessibility for folks with disabilities. But we can always, continue to improve. So this is one area of diversity that's very important to be aware of. All right, another dimension of diversity that we spend a bit of time talking about in this week is sexual orientation. So of course, that's referring to who we are sexually attracted to. Are we attracted to members of the opposite sex or same sex or both sexes, etc.? Now, this acronym LGBTQ is a term that gets thrown around quite a bit when we're referring to members of this community who are not heterosexual. Now, if you are heterosexual, of course, you are attracted to members of the opposite sex. If you are a member of the gay community, you will often receive this acronym right here, which is referring to, it's our short form for members of the lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, and queer or questioning community. So again, just like the last group of folks that we were talking about, there's an awful lot of diversity within this group of people. So it's important to keep that in mind. The term that we use to refer to discrimination or oppression that is targeted toward somebody who is not heterosexual, who is attracted to maybe someone of the same sex or members of both sexes, is heterosexism, or more commonly referred to as homophobia. Now again, we're doing better in our society than we were 20 or 30 years ago. Same-sex marriage is legal in Canada. Members of same-sex unions have the legal right to adopt children, to build a family, for example. We are doing a lot better, but there is still quite a bit of homophobia in our society that we need to be aware of and, just continually get better about. All right, so we're also going to talk about spirituality and religion. Now, of course, this is just referring to what, religion do you belong to? What are your religious beliefs, etc.? And we know that, unfortunately, this is one of the huge areas that people experience discrimination based on. So your kind of classic historical example is going to be, Nazi Germany with the Holocaust, right? That Jewish people were persecuted. And, we have this horrible thing that happened in our history where almost, 6 million people were murdered based on their religious beliefs. So this is an extreme example of religious discrimination. A current example of religious discrimination that we see quite a bit of, unfortunately, today is Islamophobia. And that is, of course, directed at members of the Muslim faith or the Islam faith. And unfortunately, right, there are a lot of, really tragic things that are happening, and a lot of misconceptions about what it means to be a member of the Muslim faith. And we know that a lot of these things are based on very serious forms of misinformation, based on the actions of a few, extremist organizations, groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS that, or Al-Qaeda and ISIS that say they are members of a certain religion when we know that they do not accurately, validly represent this religion, right? We know that, that the values of Islam are not being truly represented by these groups. It's the exact same thing when it comes to, groups like the Ku Klux Klan, for example, that say that they are, that they identify as Christian, right? And, that they have discriminated against groups like African Americans, for example, in the United States, when we know that they do not represent that religion. So we need to be very careful about making generalizations and assumptions about members of a particular faith or religion based on the actions of so few people, right? That they do not represent what it means to truly be a member of that religion. Because unfortunately, we are still seeing lots of acts of discrimination, so that's one thing to consider there. Now, all of this is leading up to a discussion about social inequalities, right? A social inequality is going to be when there's a lack of social or economic resources for a particular group, and that can lead to reduced opportunities like education, healthcare, employment. It can limit a group's civil rights, lead to health disparities, for example. So these are really serious outcomes of discrimination and oppression. Now, this term intersectionality is a really important concept for this particular unit. You can absolutely bet that this concept will pop up on the test this week. So just make sure that you're familiar with it. Now, this is when, of course, each of us as a human being, right, we have multiple dimensions of our identity. So I am a woman, I am a member of a particular religious faith, I have a particular sexual orientation, I have an experience of ability or disability, a certain socioeconomic status, for example. Now, depending on how each one of these dimensions of my identity intersect with one another, that is going to contribute to my experience of social advantages or privileges, or disadvantages or oppression or discrimination. So what we often find, unfortunately, historically, is that there are certain elements of a person's identity that have been more associated with different forms of discrimination, disadvantages, oppression, right? We know that people of color are more likely to be discriminated against or to experience racism. We know that members of the LGBTQ community are more likely to experience homophobia, for example. So depending on how each one of these elements of a person's personality intersect with one another, that is going to contribute to our experience of privilege or oppression or discrimination. And what we find is that based on these elements of our identity, you might be more likely to experience discrimination and oppression than another person based on all of these factors of your identity, right? If you are a person of color, a person from a low-income background, maybe a person from the LGBTQ community, a person with a disability, it might be more likely, for example.